Quarantine class. Welcome to lesson 6 of our fiction writing unit, aka Arc of the Story. Today is a big day. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a story arc so that you can start to plan and build your fiction stories. We worked really hard on coming up with ideas. We've examined our characters. We figured out some drama. We put all those things together. And now it's time to think about what we're going to write. Okay? Some of you may be familiar with this chart that I'm about to show you. Others of you may not. But either way, we're going to go through the story arc and I'm going to explain to you why it is so helpful to do before you start writing and how it will actually make the act of writing your story a lot easier for you. So, let's get right into it. Does this look familiar? It might look familiar, and it should look familiar. These are what we call the basic elements of a story. We've got our introduction, our rising action, a climax, falling action, and then a resolution. All stories follow this basic pattern, okay? Some stories, as you get older, may have a little more rising action and then a little bit of falling, some more rising action, then falling, and then a climax, and then falling action, and then an end. But for the most part, the stories that you read and the stories that you write follow this pattern. And it's pretty self-explanatory. I've got an introduction. It's where I introduce everyone to the main character. We kind of get a little bit of background on the type of person that character is. And then there's rising action. So this is where the problem comes into play, okay? And you could include the problem in your introduction as well. But either one is really fine. But the rising action is when the problem happens and how it gets worse. And then the climax is when that problem gets resolved. And then the falling action is kind of what happens after that problem is resolved. And then the resolution is the end, okay? So those 5 parts are what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, I'm going to do this for you right on the fly, live, okay? And I'm going to show you what kind of thinking needs to go into this this part of our writing unit. Because we're going to do the hard work now so that when we sit down and start writing our stories, whether we're going to type them or whether we're going to write them in our writer's notebooks, when we sit down to write our stories, this chart is going to make everything so much easier for us. Let me show you how. I've taken those parts and I've broken them down into introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Now, when I'm thinking about these things, I don't need to be specific yet. I'm not writing my story yet. I'm just trying to help myself think about how I want to organize my thoughts, how I want to organize my story, okay? So you'll notice that I'm going to use a lot of really short sentences. I'm not going to get all that descriptive unless it's something that I really want to remember. It's a great idea that I have. But for the most part, I want to keep it concise. I want to keep it short and sweet, just as a way for me to remember when I start writing what I wanted to say in each section. So as you'll remember, the introduction is when we meet the character, and we may or may not find out the problem, okay? So I'm going to write in my introduction, Tim, who has a mean sister, always picks on him. He is not sure how or ever he can get back at her. Okay, so I've introduced my main character, Tim, who has a mean sister. We're going to call her Lynn. Oops. That always picks on him. He's not sure how or ever he can get back at her. All right? That's all I need. I have 2 quick sentences. Tells me exactly what I want to write about, tells you exactly what you want to write about. Again, this is for you. If you want to write more sentences for your introduction or any part of this, that is fine. But really, we should be using this just as a way to jog our minds about how we want to organize things. So the next section is a rising action. And if you'll recall, this is where the problem gets worse, okay? Tim has tried several ways to get back at Lynn, but none of them have worked. In fact, he's gotten, oops, I've actually interchanged this. In fact, his sister has gotten him into trouble. He needs to come up with a plan to get back at his mean sister. Okay? Again, very short, very simple, just the basic idea of what I want to have in that rising action section. Well, how does my problem get worse, and what does that main character do about it? Now I'm at the climax, how the problem is resolved. So, Tim decides to, oops, to put his sister in a garbage can and roll her down the driveway. The plan works. His sister is furious. Tim feels like he has gotten revenge. Okay? So this is the most exciting part of the story. This is where Tim finally figures out a plan, goes through with that plan, and it actually works. Notice how I'm not showing a lot of detail. That's what I'm going to do in my story. This is just helping me figure out what I want to put in there, the basic idea of what I want to put there. So all of you should be noticing that I'm just putting basic ideas in here. I'm not being very specific. I'm not using sensory details. I'm not using transitions. These are just the ideas I want in each section of my story, okay? For following action, remember, what happens after the problem is resolved? Well, after the problem is resolved, Lynn tries to get her parents to ground, whoops, to get her parents to show how awful Tim was to her. But it doesn't work because mom and dad tell her how awful she has Tim and that maybe she deserved it. Okay? I've got a really good idea for that last part there. Maybe she deserved it, but I can keep that idea in my head. If I couldn't keep that idea in my head, I would write it down. But I'm going to keep that idea in my head and save it for later because it's so good that I know I'm not going to forget it. And then the resolution. Tim doesn't get in trouble. His sister stops picking on him for a while. Not for good, unfortunately. Okay? So there you have it. Look at what Mr. Leibitz did. All 5 sections right off the top of my head. Now, it may not go as quick as it did for you, but I've got a really good thought in my head for how I want my story to go. I've thought a lot about my characters, Tim and Lynn. I've thought a lot about my problem and how that problem gets worse and how I resolve that problem. And I've thought a lot about how other people view my character. So that made this a little bit easier because I did all of that planning before I got to this point. And that's going to be your job today. Today, I've included a story arc, just like you saw back here in your Google Doc. And I've included each of these sections with an explanation of what each one is and what you should do, with a lot of space to write a couple of sentences so that you can decide what you would like in each of those parts. I truly cannot wait to see your planning for this assignment before we really start getting to drafting and some other tips and tricks that I have for you for your fiction stories next